Have you ever wondered why governments never seem to run out of debt? Every year, governments borrow billions or even trillions of dollars. Most people assume governments eventually pay all that money back. But that's not what actually happens. Instead, governments continue borrowing again and again. In fact, many governments have been borrowing money for generations. Some countries have never completely eliminated their national debt. At first, that sounds like terrible financial management. But governments don't manage money the same way families do. The rules are completely different. Let's imagine a very simple country. Every year, people pay taxes to the government. Those taxes pay for roads, schools, hospitals, and public services. But sometimes governments want to spend even more. Imagine the government collects $100, but it plans to spend $120. Now, there's a $20 shortfall. The government has only 3 realistic options. Each option comes with its own problems. So in many cases, governments choose to borrow the missing money. But who is actually lending money to the government? The answer isn't just banks. Many different investors lend money to governments. Even ordinary people can become lenders. They do this by buying government bonds. A government bond is simply a promise to repay borrowed money later. Think of it like an IOU from the government. You give the government money today. The government promises to return it in the future, and it usually pays interest along the way. That's why many investors are happy to buy government bonds. They earn steady income without taking huge risks. For many countries, government bonds are considered very safe because governments usually have reliable ways to raise money. One of those ways is collecting taxes. As long as taxes keep coming in, lenders feel more confident. But what happens when the government still can't repay everything? This is where things become interesting. Governments often don't repay old debt with saved money. Instead, they usually borrow new money to repay old debt. This process is called rolling over debt. Imagine replacing an old loan with a brand new one. The old debt disappears, but a new debt immediately takes its place. The total debt may barely change. It looks strange, but it happens every single day. Countries around the world refinance debt all the time. That's why national debt rarely falls to zero. The goal isn't to eliminate debt completely. The real goal is to keep debt under control. So how do economists decide whether debt is too high? They don't just look at the amount of debt. Instead, they compare debt with the size of the economy. This measurement is called the debt-to-GDP ratio. Think of GDP as a country's yearly income. A larger economy can usually support more debt, just like a high-income family can borrow more than a low-income family. The same idea applies to entire countries. That's why 2 countries can owe the same amount of money, but face completely different levels of risk. Let's compare 2 imaginary countries. Both countries owe $1 trillion. At first glance, they look exactly the same. But country A has a much larger economy. That means it earns far more money every year. Paying interest is much easier for country A. Country B has a much smaller economy. The same debt becomes much harder to manage. That's why debt alone doesn't tell the full story. Context is what really matters. But debt can still become dangerous, especially if investors lose confidence. If lenders stop buying government bonds, the government suddenly has a problem. It still has old debt that must be repaid. But now nobody wants to lend new money. This could trigger a debt crisis. Interest rates begin rising very quickly. Borrowing becomes much more expensive. That's when debt can become a serious economic problem. History has shown that debt crises can happen very quickly. Confidence can disappear almost overnight. One famous example is Greece. For years, Greece borrowed more and more money. Eventually, investors became worried. Many stopped lending money. Borrowing costs exploded. The government was forced to cut spending. Many people lost their jobs. The economy became much weaker. But not every country with high debt faces the same problem. Take Japan as an example. Japan has one of the highest debt levels in the world. Yet investors continue lending money because they believe Japan can continue meeting its obligations. Trust is one of the most valuable assets a government can have. Without trust, borrowing becomes much harder. Without borrowing, rolling over debt becomes impossible. That's when governments can face a real financial emergency. So the real question isn't whether a country has debt, but whether it can manage it. Now let's answer the biggest question. Why don't governments simply pay off all their debt? The first reason is that debt isn't always bad. Borrowing allows governments to invest today. Those investments can help the economy grow tomorrow. A stronger economy produces more income, and that makes future debt easier to manage. The second reason is opportunity cost. Every dollar used to repay debt can't be spent somewhere else. Governments must constantly make difficult choices. Paying off every dollar of debt could require massive tax increases, or it could require huge spending cuts. Neither option is politically easy. That's why governments usually look for balance. Borrow enough to grow, but not so much that investors lose confidence. Good debt supports the future. Bad debt creates bigger problems later. The challenge is knowing the difference. And that's one of the hardest jobs in economics. So, can a country ever become completely debt-free? Yes, but it's extremely rare. Most governments choose not to eliminate all debt. Instead, they focus on keeping it sustainable. As long as investors keep trusting the government and the economy continues growing, governments can keep refinancing old debt without causing a financial crisis. That's why national debt is very different from household debt. The same rules simply don't apply. A country can borrow for generations without ever paying off every dollar, because the goal isn't zero debt. The goal is a healthy economy. A growing economy makes debt easier to handle. That's the real secret behind government borrowing. Debt isn't automatically good or bad. What matters is how the money is used, and whether the country can continue earning enough to support it. Understanding that changes the way we think about national debt forever. The next time you hear that a country owes trillions of dollars, don't immediately assume the country is going bankrupt. Instead, ask whether the economy is strong enough to support that debt, because that's the question economists care about most. Now you know why governments can keep borrowing for decades without ever paying off all their debt. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy learning finance through simple animations, subscribe for more.